Now, last time we were talking about the figure of the millennial leader, the prophet of a political movement, and the way in which Patrick Pearse fitted out the profile of the divided man, the messianic figure, the head of a nativistic movement. Tonight I want to focus on another kind of leader of a cultural movement, a revitalization movement that fits still the same pattern that Anthony Wallace is talking about, and talk about the artist rather than the prophet. If we kind of look at the role of the artist in society, I think it's perhaps best to go back and start with tribal society and move forward to get the sense of the different modalities to the relationship of the artist in time and the artist with his historical milieu. In tribal society, especially, say, in the Celtic tradition, the bard really is the memory of a pre-literate society, since the sacred esoteric traditions are not to be trusted to writing. And even at the dawn of Western civilization, Plato shows a lot of suspicion about writing. It weakens your memory. It tends to democratize sacred information so that the wrong information gets into the wrong hands. And writing is just suspicious as a vehicle of communication. So that the esoteric has to be held in the hands of those people who are really prepared for it. And in the case of poetry, the bard is a man who, in a sense, has a calling to it. And so there's a kind of shamanistic quality to the bard. The quality of the memory of a bard in pre-literate societies is really staggering. Even into the 20th century, Robin Flower could go out into the Aran Islands and the Blasket Islands and stop at a wall just by a road to take a rest, and an Irish peasant would come up to him and hail to him and greet him. And then as they begin to chat, he'd say, "Are you interested in the stories?" And he said, "Yes," and then he'd begin to recite all the ancient legends of Ireland. And in the case of this one bard that Robin Flower had met, he could recite things as long as the Iliad, or the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. This is true for Yugoslavian poets. It was true for the bards in the time of Homer. And it's generally universally true. The human memory can store an enormous amount of information. And in that particular culture, as McLuhan would say, when the sensorium is oral, and you interact with a vibratory space, and you're cued in to your environment because of sound, and there's a whole sense that there's a participatory resonance of each in everything, and that all and everything are in sympathetic resonance, and everything is tuned like a tuning fork, that the oral sensorium is reinforced, and the ability to relate to information in that way is greatly increased, whereas in the other shift, as McLuhan talks about it, when the sensibility becomes more visual, then a lot of that material is lost. So the bard is really the memory of pre-literate society. He's the voice of myth and tradition. He's not necessarily a shaman or a magician. He's not necessarily the same person. There may be shamanistic qualities to a bard, and there may be magical spells that he will know. But oftentimes he can just be a memory bank, so that the king will say to the bard, "What are the Brehon laws for the following offense?" And then the bard will just give a printout on what the laws are, word for word, for the particular occasion. And there are some aspects of it that can be magical, but for the most part, there are other men of religious calling or vocations who've gone through this kind of crisis and transformation that makes them the shaman. And so the bard is not necessarily the same person as a shaman. Now, when we shift from pre-literate society to urban literate civilization, especially pre-industrial and feudal Europe, the artist is not the doorway to eternity. He is really merely a humble servant. Divinity really edges the prince, and so the whole divine right of kings is a situation where the king has certain numinous qualities, and there is numinous qualities to the bloodlines. And the artist is really a servant, and he's a servant to courts, and he's a servant to the king or to the queen. So myth and ceremony revolve around king and pope. Throne and altar really become the magical spaces, as the way Locke talks about throne and altar as the kind of key symbols. Now, Shakespeare and Chaucer really are servants of kings, and in this sense, Shakespeare really did not take himself as seriously as, say, the 19th century took Shakespeare very seriously and constructed a very romantic Shakespeare. But the Shakespeare of his own time was a man who was very much a servant of the court, and he used art to really become a gentleman and regain the family coat of arms. And after he was a success as in the dubious calling of being an artist and a playwright, he bought the biggest house in town and moved back into his hometown to lord it all over the people who used to make fun of him and when he got in trouble, when he got the girl in trouble, and all of that kind of country sort of thing. So he was returning in the grand formula of going to the city to make your fortune, and then returning to your village and setting yourself up with the biggest house in town and the new coat of arms. So that the artist is very much a servant, and in, say, Spenser's Faerie Queene, you see very much the celebration of Elizabeth, and the artist is used to become the voice of the ritual vision, just as in classical Greece. The sculptures are still closely allied to religion and the celebration of the religious worldview. The artist has not become a specialist that has broken away and says, this is important because I say so, because I am an artist. So there's a kind of process to this, a development of art. In the archaic period, art is very much the product of artisans who are anonymous, and the culture is really expressed through the art form. And then as the artist becomes a full-time specialist, he begins to come into his own, but he's still in harmony with the ritual matrix, and he's still in harmony with the worldview of the culture and the religion at large. And then as that process develops from the classical to the Baroque, then he becomes a specialist on his own and says, I am the artist, I am important on my own terms, I'm not just painting the vision of Christianity, I am Michelangelo. And then you get the battle between Michelangelo and the Pope. So that comes at a very developed level of art in society. And it comes only at later stages when the artist can really begin to take himself seriously and think, I am really something very special, so that I'm going to challenge the whole culture, which would be inconceivable in folk art, would be inconceivable in the archaic and even the early classical periods. Now in industrial society, the school and the marketplace and private property begin to replace throne and altar as the basic archetypal symbols. The sacred space and its economic expression in land and blood and soil and peasantry gives way to abstract information. So knowledge is democratized by giving every man his Protestant Bible, and you break up oral Catholic feudal culture. And information is democratized in the sense that the middle classes begin to gain control of economic means through stocks and bonds and mathematics. And information is really what stocks and bonds are all about. And of course, going along with this, the other master of information is, of course, the artist, who is beginning to tell the stories and reinterpret the worldview and try to re-explain what reality and time and space are all about, as the declining religious worldview begins to no longer be the sufficient explanation of what everything's all about. Industrial society is very much a shift, and it's a shift toward information and a shift toward new values of school and marketplace. And you can see this developing in many of the different artistic traditions. If, for example, you look at the history of drama in the West, it starts out with just a little play, a playlet called the Quem Quaeritas trope in the Middle Ages, where it occurs to someone, wouldn't it be nice if we acted out Jesus, the four women waiting at the tomb for Easter? And so they come and say, Quem Quaeritas in sepulchro, O Christo coli? Whom do you seek, O Christians, in the tomb? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And they go through this little ritual, and so they do it inside the church. And then slowly, as it develops, it goes to the portal of the church, and then finally, as it develops and secularizes, it goes out into the marketplace in the cathedral and becomes the guild plays and the mystery plays. And theater begins to become so secular by the time of the Renaissance. With Shakespeare, theater becomes its own institution, and it has its own architectural structure, and there is a displacement from the sacred space to the economic space, and that both theater and cathedral may revolve around the marketplace. But the marketplace is beginning to be the real power that brings people together, until finally you have, in, say, Polanyi's study of the Great Transformation, the shift away from sacred space until the marketplace begins to be really the whole emerging world system. And of course this is reinforced by, say, Wallerstein's study of the growth of the world economy in the 16th century. So in this shift, information is very important, and both the capitalist with his stocks and bonds and the new artist are becoming masters of information, so that though they're opposite in content, they're not opposite in structure. Now, as the middle classes begin to displace the aristocracy, the artist really takes up the charismatic role that once was reserved for the prince. And he begins to have the the divinity that edged a prince now edges the artist. So he has this in structure. But since bishops and princes are still around, there's obviously a tension between them, because as the new comes in, the old just doesn't lie down and die and just disappear. So obviously you get battles going back and forth, and you see this in Beethoven, you see it in Mozart, and it's very much what the 19th century is all about as Europe shifts from a feudal Christian oral culture into a literate, industrial, capitalistic bourgeois culture. Now what the artist does is he uses print, especially the literary artist, and large bourgeois audiences to, in a sense, bring back the role of the tribal bard. And he creates romantically an image of the bard that did not exist in actual pre-literate society, folk society. So if you take some of these romantic pictures of the bard with his hair blowing in the wind, standing on top of craggy mountain, and there's this huge torrent, and he's alone confronting the infinity of the sky, that image is very much the 19th century image of the bard. It's a romantic celebration of the bard, and it's really compressing the bard and shaman into one role called the artist, written in capital letters across the sky, so that the whole romantic myth that has now just died, except some people here in East Hampton don't realize that it's died, the romantic image of the artist who sees deeper and sees farther and feels deeper and is breathes deeper and is more alive and more important than anyone else, that peculiar creature is created in the Romantic movement, and is definitely a product of the late 18th and the turning into the 19th century. And it's a compression of bard and shaman. So while bard and shaman are not the same figures in pre-literate society, they definitely become in the image of the bard as it begins to be created by Gray and Blake and on into Yeats. Now there's a paradox here, and I've been concentrating on the sense of the paradox of these opposites all along, and of course Yeats is the consummate artist of paradox and opposites and dialectic. Bourgeois industrial society of mass-produced books, which is obviously an industrial process, creates the condition of the artist as institution, and you get Dickens or a Yeats. If you didn't have the institution of the Victorian lending library, if you didn't have the institution of mass-producing cheap books so that the newly affluent middle classes have the money and the leisure so that women can be in, those chaise longues chewing bonbons and reading long novels that are 900, and 1,000 words long, then you couldn't possibly have the image of the artist independent, on his own, trying to become the voice of society. Before that, they really depended upon the aristocracy, as Mozart depended upon the aristocracy, and even into the time of Wagner, depending upon the Prince of Bavaria. So that there's the paradox that mechanization and industrialization are creating the democratization of information that enables the artist to emerge as the Dickensian figure of the artist as institution unto himself. So the phenomenology of this cultural change is that people are moving from the pre-industrial village into the city, and there's a movement into collectivization and mass movements. But that very mass movement is creating its linked opposite, the individual. So individual and the masses are part of the linked opposites of the 19th century, whereas before, and of course what comes with that is alienation. If you have freedom, then you have to have alienation. If you go back to the pre-industrial village, then you have what Marx called the idiocy of rural life. Then you have your identity coming from time, because everybody knows your generations and your parents. You have your identity coming from space, from the soil, and you live in one place. And you have community, but you do not have freedom. And therefore, the price of community means the surrender of the intense egoism of the individual alone, absolutely anarchically making his way from rags to riches. So the opposites are linked, and the paradox is very much this drama of mass and individual. And of course the artist will, throughout the whole period of the Romantic celebration of the artist, will be engaged with this kind of love-hate with the bourgeoisie. He will pretend to not be bourgeois at the same time that he totally depends upon the bourgeoisie, so that the artist is like an orchid growing in a jungle. Now, in the industrial materialistic society of facts, as Dickens focused on it in Hard Times, you have the phenomenology of opposite, that this materialistic society creates the chemistry of LSD, which then takes millions out of materialism into mysticism, though obviously there's a similarity between General Motors and General Mysticism and the whole democratization of mysticism in the kind of Leary, John Lilly kind of movement. But nevertheless, there's still that kind of paradox that the industrialization process is creating its opposite. This is where we come to the Desjardins kind of vision of these opposites, that increasing collectivization leads to hyper-personalization. You cannot really beat your chest and say, I am the artist, in Chaucer's time. You just simply are not that important. You can't get away with it. The art isn't considered that significant. It's not an interpreter of the whole meaning of human existence. It just happens to be nice, interesting, fun, maybe useful for offering works ad maiorem Dei gloriam, but it's not the be-all and end-all of human existence. There is no archetypal numinosity to it, and so you have to behave yourself. When you move to such a situation of increasing collectivization and people move into the cities and they move out of the pre-industrial villages and they move out of Christendom and move into a commercial civilization, then you get hyper-personalization coming from collectivization, which is basically Desjardins' thesis. Now, since economics and the opening up of new economic space and the rise of the marketplace and the rise of the world economy and the world system is the source of collectivization, then art becomes, in a sense, a charismatic war against economic routinization. So you have TVs in Caracas, and you have cheap, mass-produced art displacing folk art. So you have this kind of exchange where when you come into Dublin and say, now it's 1913 and we can afford to have a picture gallery in Dublin and we're becoming an important European city, that's precisely at the time that the folk arts are beginning to be destroyed by industrialization, by modernization. And so the shift to high culture placed in museums breaks up art into high culture and cheap mass-produced junk, so that the peasants will begin using mass-produced crucifixes and lurid Italian or German holy cards tacked onto the walls of their white cottages. In a dynamic and alive folk culture, you don't get that. You have really fantastically good folk art, so that when you look, even going through the historical museums and looking at early Celtic art, it's all good. There's no split between the sacred and the profane or high art and low art, whether it's a safety pin or just a brooch for a coat or a casual a spoon. It's all made with a kind of religious mindfulness to detail. So there's a paradox that as we move into industrialization, we introduce the shoddy, and as a compensation we celebrate fine art, and you find cultures that no longer can dynamically create great art attempt to surround the world and buy it all up and put it into museums, so that you get the phenomenon of Norton Simon in Los Angeles moving in and buying all the Oriental art and all the Asian art and all the African art at the same time that the culture in Los Angeles has reached its kind of limits, and it itself is not generating much except the TV movie industry. So there's very much a paradox of opposites. I remember seeing this very clearly once when I was in the peasant market in Toluca in Mexico, which was one of the largest peasant markets. And at the outskirts of the market, you see the Mexicans themselves hawking their wares, and they're generally hawking things like braziers and really cheap tin pots and pans. And the Indians are buying the braziers and the cheap pots and pans. If you go all the way into the heart of the market, there you find the American university women without braziers buying the hand-woven serapes. And the hand-woven serapes that they wear, that they're not supposed to wear because they're meant for men, much to the chagrin of the peasant who doesn't know whether to go ahead and sell it to the woman or to follow custom and not to sell it. But you see this very much, that what we want are those really superbly designed and superbly executed hand-woven materials of the folk art. So we're both going in opposite directions. And this is very much the paradox of mass and individual in the shift from traditional Christian society to industrial commercial society. Now, since economics is the source of collectivization, and it's school and marketplace that is breaking up the power of throne and altar and breaking up conservative society, just as in the agricultural revolution. It was the way in which the hunting band reconstituted itself as the trading band that broke up the matriarchal nexus of Anatolia in the 7th millennium. There is a process here whereby economics and the movement into new economic trading space displaces the old sacred matrix, and a new society emerges. This is what Redfield talks about in the difference between the technical order and the moral order, so that the technical order breaks away and the moral order becomes the conservative voice of the tradition. You can see it happening in the 7th millennium, and then it happens BC, and then it happens again with the rise of the liberals and the rise of the bourgeoisie, as Dickens chronicles it in Hard Times. Now, as economic routinization begins to create the structures of collectivization by industrializing the planet, by surrounding all the cultures in the crystal palace of glass and iron, the artist, in an equal and opposite compensatory movement, picks up the destroyed tradition and romantically alters it into a new ideal and creates romanticism and nostalgia of the past and goes back to a Middle Ages that never existed in the Middle Ages and becomes really basically conservative. So that what we've seen in this whole course in focusing on art so heavily as a indication of what's going on in the process of industrialization, we really see that art is intensely conservative, and that in more often than not, the really great artists have been voices of the conservative tradition. It's Goldsmith against the Enclosure Acts, it's Wordsworth against the railroads, Edgeworth against the industrialization or the capitalization of agriculture, it's Dickens against laissez-faire economics, it's Synge against urbanization, and here now with Yeats, it's Yeats against industrial bourgeois democracies. And so he's even extending it to the political aspect and becoming a voice right at the time that aristocracy is about to disappear forever. You get this sunset effect again, and Yeats becomes a voice of tradition, high culture, aristocracy, the best that there is, against mechanization, industrialization, democratization, against the foul, shoddy works of the Chicagos and Manchesters and Liverpools and Birmingham. For the Marxist critics like Conor Cruise O'Brien, this is the crypto-fascism of Yeats. But I think if one looks at Yeats and Lawrence as well, this conservative tradition is really not the same as industrializing fascism, because Italian fascism and German fascism is really part and parcel of the industrialization and retribalization at the same time. And Yeats is even more conservative than that. He's going back to a totally vanishing culture. Now, for Yeats in particular, this means that he has to be against the overwhelming mass of his age, at the same time that his age is making it possible for an individual to take on the whole culture. This would be inconceivable in any other kind of culture. But of course the basic paradox is, how can he possibly escape it? And so the relationship to time becomes the drama of Yeats's whole career. So what's posed by Yeats then is really the problem of the individual in time, the problem of the individual in history, and it becomes really one of escape versus engagement. A conflict between solitude and society in which the self uses civilization and tradition to express itself and humble society. I am the great artist. You do not understand. You are ignorant dolts. You are part of the lumpen proletariat. I am the genius. And at the same time, he has to use the whole civilization to create the mystique of the tradition. So we have here again another kind of paradox, another phenomenology of opposites. The individual becomes self-realized through the medium of a culture. A society becomes conscious of itself as a culture through individual creations. So Ireland has to understand itself through Yeats. America has to understand itself through Whitman or Melville or Faulkner. And so there is very much a conflict between individual and society, in which the individual needs the culture to express himself and create individual works, at the same time that society has to compress and threaten the individual. And so the conflict between individual and society, between artist and civilization or artist and culture, is really part of a larger dialectic. And in a way we can say that conflict is systemic to society, is systemic to human culture, and that there's no particular situation in which you can have one winning and the other losing. It's not a win-lose situation, but it is one in which conflict is inevitable. Now, without individual creations in culture, and we can identify that as the charismatic force. Charisma means divine gift. So if the inspired artist brings the inspiration down into the form of work of art and then gives the gift to society. This is the charismatic endowment, and society becomes the mere collection of routines. They're busy routinizing the gifts from the previous generation. So right when society has finally decided that what art is all about, a la Tennyson, that's when a new generation is coming in and saying, no, it's not Tennysonian. And this is, of course, true for science as well, so that we can say the process that we're describing here with the artist is true for the inventor or the scientist, and not just simply poets and painters. So Yeats' whole career then is really a conflict with society, and the fascination with the conflict is how he really dances it out. He really raises it to an incredible level of sophisticated consciousness, and it's not just rationally done. It's not the same quality of the artist as con artist that we're familiar with today in New York painting, whereas McLuhan says art is anything you can get away with. It's much more an intuitive thing. There isn't a rational calculating Yeats who says, I will now do this step and this step. There's more of a feeling the wind in his sails and acting out his intuitive qualities, but somehow always being at the right place at the right time and doing what is exactly necessary for the greater growth of his own work. So the conflict back and forth with society is what the dialectic of his life is all about. In the early stage of his life, in looking over when he was reviewing the proofs for his first book of poetry, he came to an interesting consciousness of himself and saw himself reflected in ways that he hadn't seen before. And he wrote about it in a letter to a friend, quoting Yeats now. I've noticed something about my poetry I did not know before in this process of correction. For instance, that it is almost all a flight into fairyland from the real world and a summons to that flight. The chorus to the stolen child sums it up. The chorus is, come away, for the world is more full of suffering than you can ever understand. That it is not the poetry of insight and knowledge, but of longing and complaint, the cry of the heart against necessity. I hope someday to alter that and write poetry of insight and knowledge. So the first aspect of Yeats is the escape from London and cities and industrialization and the whole squalor of the Liverpools of the modern world. And so in London, as he's walking down a street in the Strand and he sees this little bauble floating in a jet of water, he thinks back to the flowing waters of the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and he writes the poem, I Will Arise and Go Now and Go to Innisfree. And so the tension in Yeats is the being located in time and in history and generating out of it a pastoral. Now, a pastoral is always a place that has no conflict that we generate when we're right in the midst of conflict. So pastorals are not real places. You can't take rent up in a flat in a pastoral. It's very much the mirror opposite of whatever you're into. So that if you're in an intensely electronic, highly industrial, highly urbanized society, then you get Johnny Cash playing the guitar with an electronic image of a railroad behind him, playing it a la Nashville for an audience of 50 million people on color TV. That's when you get hippie fantasies of wearing overalls and going back to the 19th century and having Pepperidge Farms and crunchy granola. All of those are fantasies, they're pastorals, and they're an attempt to escape the historical condition which is too horrible for words. So pastoral is a mirror opposite, and you can't understand the pastoral unless you understand what they're coming from. This is why, especially say with the rich and the children from wealthy bourgeois families or just affluent professional families, comes the fascination of girls wearing overalls and bib and tucker kinds of things. Or now I notice with the Southampton wealthy teenagers, the girls in junior high are wearing these kind of pants that have the straps for holding hammers and wrenches and things of this sort, and they're very baggy. So on the one hand, it's a celebration of woman's independence because they don't want the trousers to really caress the ass and make them really sexually attractive in traditional ways. On the other hand, they're an attempt to move into a male image by taking on a working class garb, and one that has places for wrenches and hammers and the rest of it. But the junior high child is still living in Southampton and still living the life of the affluent upper middle classes. So she's living out a fantasy costume and creating a pastoral to compensate for the actual historical reality in which she finds herself. Now in the country that Yeats creates imaginatively is oral culture and stories that are more ancient than any of the history told in the cities. So the city becomes like a movie set that talks about progress and the gross national product. And when you move outside of that movie set and you go to the eternal landscape of the dolmens and the cairns of Ireland, then you move into a landscape of oral information that goes back to Atlantis and beyond and back into the darkness of time. And it contains a history so large that cosmic history can only be conceived in consciousness in the images of myth. So myth in the ancient religion and all the old prophecies begin to possess his imagination. And it's precisely these old prophecies that are not heard in London. One of them has to do with that the battle of Apocalypse will be fought in a particular valley called the Valley of the Black Pig. The dew drops slowly and dreams gather. Unknown spears suddenly hurtle before my dream-awakened eyes, and then the clash of fallen horsemen and the cries of unknown perishing armies beat about my ears. We who still labor by the cromlech on the shore, the grey cairn on the hill, when day sinks drowned in dew, being weary of the world's empires, bow down to you, master of the still stars and of the flaming door. Now, in the movie that I asked you to see on the Yeats country, they sensitively photographed the cairn on top the mountain of Knocknarea so that the sunset is behind it. And Maeve's cairn begins to look like a doorway to another world, and it begins to be a doorway to the astral plane and to the sensitive, mediumistic poet. He can, walking around these old monuments and PowerPoints, he can begin to hear the noise of all the battles that have gone before, and the whole normal landscape of routine, operational, industrial Liverpool and Belfast have just wiped out with a new kind of infinite time and infinite space. So it's as if one's wandering in a movie set and then suddenly someone rips up the movie set and carries them off to the sky, and you look out and the landscape just extends to infinity, and your eyes have to adjust to new light and new darkness, and you can't discern what shapes are really there, and your whole consciousness moves into the landscape, and the whole subconscious and the collective consciousness of the race is reflected, which of course is a technique of Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan for going out into the desert and precipitating the collective unconsciousness through absolute solitude. So in moving into the solitary world of Sligo and Connemara and the west of Ireland, he's moving into a landscape where the ruins, the cairns and the cromlechs are older than anything in Europe. And now, of course, with Colin Renfrew's work, we even know that they're older than the pyramids. So now, in that landscape, which is his native landscape, born as he is in the West, now he joins all of those negating England, and the subjective poet tries to move back, not into London, but into Dublin, and tries to have Dublin as the interface between the industrial empire, the mightiest empire the world had seen, and the intensely sacred landscape of the Western Island with the consciousness going back to Atlantean times. He tries to move to Dublin and have that as the creative interface, the place of tension between opposites, where he, as a writer in English, printing books, can become the voice of an oral culture that goes into the darkness of time. And so he moves into a kind of political space and goes back into society, but it's not London society now, it's Dublin society, and he begins to adopt and take over the prophecies that a war is coming and somehow the Irish are destined to bring down the mightiest empire that the world had ever seen. So the subjective poet who was just looking for the Lake Isle of Innisfree and was just talking about, I'm going to escape history, and 9 bean rows will I have there, for peace comes dropping slow, and he envisions total isolation, which of course is a fantasy we all have when we've had it with conflict, and we think, oh boy, if I could just be totally free, then I'd be happy. And of course it's never true, because the other half of us is just loving the conflict for all it's worth, and the busyness and the activity, and all that gives us for realizing the fullness of ourselves. So the subjective poet flings himself out of his celebrated solitude back into society and into politics and the Irish literary Renaissance. And just as Dublin is beginning to turn away from the Home Rule movement with the fall of Parnell, he says, now, let us mourn, but now let's go in this direction into art and to literature and to mysticism. In the same way that when the 60s revolution in America failed, then America took a turn and it went in the direction of mysticism and began to lose its fascination with the kind of hardline SDS political approach. The same thing happened before in Dublin, and at that time Yeats was right there saying, all right, now let's go in this direction and let's give up the politics for a moment. So he joins in with his countrymen and begins to celebrate what it means to be Irish. Though he's caught at that interface, but that's a very creative place to be caught. He's a Protestant, and he's writing in English, and he's trying to become the voice of Catholic folk traditions, which are oral, not written. Now, the interesting thing about Yeats in dancing out this conflict of opposites is unconsciously he always chooses a work that must fail. Now, here again is the way that the process of failure comes in with the artist as it did for the prophetic figure. Remember how I told you last time where charismatic figures really must fail, that there has to be an aspect of martyrdom, that success means success in the routine operational world, but somehow or other the really charismatic figures are the crucified ones. This is why Che Guevara became more of a messianic figure for Latin America than Castro, because Castro had to take over the shop and worry about the sugar crop and worry about the tobacco crop and worry about the Americans and trade embargoes and the rest of it. But Guevara could move into death and into a simplification that death allowed and become a figure of martyrdom. So there was a simplification through intensity by embracing failure and by always trying to choose a work that must fail. It's much like a man who would always choose to find a woman who would reject him and always go through one tragic rejected love affair after another. So that and Synge did this a bit. It was important for Synge, in a sense, to be rejected by women, and his love life was very unhappy, and he was never really a success with women. So in this sense, Patrick Pearse was never really a success, and he was much more a success in failure, in being executed by firing squad, than he ever could have been if he actually became the first president of Ireland. There's no way that Patrick Pearse could have been a successful president. So the aspect of Yeats is that this is a little more conscious and unconscious. Again, Yeats is, I suppose the reason I'm fascinated with Yeats is he has this fascination with edges. He's right at the edge of consciousness and unconsciousness, and the quality of failure that he's going through is not the same as Patrick Pearse, who is a straight-out failure as a poet, and damn near became a straight-out failure as a politician. If it weren't for the fact that he was martyred, he would have been a failure as a revolutionary. So that Yeats, when he comes to dealing with failure, always chooses a project that must fail, but somehow or other its failure never really destroys him in the way that the failures of a Pearse or some of the other writers would. One of his early projects was to choose a theater and a gallery for Dublin, of all places. I mean, Dublin at this time is really just the boondocks. It's like trying to put in a theater in Cincinnati or Cleveland. I mean, it's just not a respectable place. All the artists are going off to Paris. The really charismatic place at that time is Paris and, to a degree, London. And for the artists, it's mainly Paris. This is why in 1890, both George Moore and Synge are off in Paris, and Yeats has the gall to go into Paris and say, okay, boys, it's all over, everybody back to Dublin. And he tries to engineer the whole Irish literary renaissance, and he does a fairly good job. He sends George Moore back to Dublin, he sends Lady Gregory out to Galway gathering folk tales, he sends Synge out to the Aran Islands, and he tries to do the same thing with Joyce, and then Joyce says, nope, and says, it's just a pity that you can't be influenced by me because you're just a man of letters, but I'm an artist. And here you can see the myth of the artist coming in as Yeats and Joyce fight it out with their egos back and forth with one another. But Joyce did not become one of Yeats's disciples. And to be fair to Joyce, if Yeats had died when he was 40, he would be remembered as Siegfried Sassoon is remembered, as a kind of minor poet. All the really fantastically great work that Yeats wrote, he wrote after he was 40, which is really extremely unusual in poetry. Generally, the poets write their best work in their adolescence, and that novelists may grow to the statures of Faulkner's and Mann, but poets tend to burn themselves out in the Keats, Shelley, Dylan Thomas variety. So Yeats is, like Goethe, is one of these staggering exceptions of the really great man getting greater and greater and greater all the way up into his death. There's no senescence in Yeats at all. So he chooses things that will fail, and in the early part of his life he hasn't really come into his own, but his projects are trying to get the Abbey Theatre going and trying to get a gallery for pictures in Dublin, working with Hugh Lane, Lady Gregory's nephew. And the bourgeoisie and the shopkeepers and the the tawdry people who work in the greasy till don't want any part of this, and they reject the project. And so he writes a poem to Lady Gregory that is really I think one of the finest poems about failure that's been written. Certainly every time I fail, I like to go back to it. To a friend whose work has come to nothing. Now all the truth is out, be secret and take defeat from any brazen throat. For how can you compete, being honor bred, with one who, were it proved he lies, were neither shamed in his own or in his neighbor's eyes? Bred to a harder thing than triumph, turn away, and like a laughing string whereon mad fingers play, amid a place of stone, be secret and exult, because of all things known, that is most difficult. So again, in the midst of passion and intensity and fury and fighting, he goes back to this imaginary landscape. This time it's not Innisfree, but it's a secret place of stone where a person with mad fingers plays music from a lost kingdom. So the whole aspect is, again, the fight and the conflict between time and eternity, the individual and society, between myth and history. Now, expelled by the Irish in the period of 1913, and it's a tawdry time in Dublin. It's dear, dirty Dublin at its best. It's the great strike and lockout of 1913. All the revolutionaries thought that revolution was over in Ireland and that there wasn't a chance, and it was a period of absolute despondency. It's very much like this phenomenon that Lou talks about, that sometimes things look absolutely dead and inert, like the instant before water is about to boil or a metal is about to melt, and then suddenly it flips into its opposite and everything comes up in intense action. If you were in Dublin in 1913 and 1914, you would not have thought there was a chance for the insurrection of 1916 that was just 2 years away. The Irish were very loyally sending all their children off to fight and die in the trenches in Flanders. The enlistments were very high in Dublin for the army in 1914. And with the strike and lockout of before in 1913, everything seemed to be economics and reality and the crisis of Lloyd George's budget and all those sort of real things. And so the poetry of revolution seemed an utter impossibility. In that period, between 13 and 16, disgusted by his failure with the attempt to get the gallery in Dublin, Yeats goes off to London and he says, the hell with these ignorant hicks. I'm going to go to the world of civilization that really appreciates my genius. And so he's spending his time in London and going to garden parties and being lionized by the aristocracy and being a house guest for the weekend with Prime Minister Asquith. And then boom, comes the insurrection, 1916, and Yeats is caught at a prime minister's house at the time that his fellow countrymen with whom he was once fighting are getting executed by firing squad. And then the guilt becomes enormous because he knows originally he wrote the sacrament of the revolution in which they were all baptized. All the Irish revolutionaries said that watching Kathleen the Houlihan acted by Maud Gunn was like being baptized in the fire of revolution. And they were confirmed in violence by his play. And so he could on the one hand say, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? At the same time that the other half of him knows that there he is having dinner with Prime Minister Asquith. So he's caught very much in a whole bind and has to come to terms with history and the whole condition of history. But at this particular time, it's not beginning to be the prophecies of the Valley of the Black Pig, which is an Irish apocalyptic prophecy, but it begins to be the larger process of European history and all of Western civilization, and he begins to look at it in very Spenglerian terms. In the poem The Magi, he has a vision of the three wise men returning and still looking, not having found the Christ. And now, 2,000 years later, it's time for another Christ, and these men are still looking, and something is about to begin. Now as at all times I can see in the mind's eye, in their stiff painted clothes, the pale unsatisfied ones appear and disappear in the blue depth of the sky, with all their ancient faces like rain-beaten stones, and all their helms of silver hovering side by side, and all their eyes still fixed, hoping to find once more, being by Calvary's turbulence unsatisfied, the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor. So even in the metric of it, he's setting it up that just as you're about to reach the thing, then there's another prolongation of the rhythm, and then the reinforcement, the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor. So that the aspect of the touching of myth with history is the copulation of opposites, and that the avatar is conceived on the floor of time while the beasts rotate in the sky and the beasts are in the stable, and in the manger with the animals is where you're going to find the king of a whole new age. So again, there's a sense that the Magi are unsatisfied and that something is about to happen. And the new prophetic imagination is not merely Irish, not merely folk tales. It's now beginning to be part of the whole imagery of European civilization. Then comes death, insurrection of 1916, and the guilt, and Ireland reclaims him with the insurrection. And you can sort of slice the early Yeats from the late Yeats with the insurrection of 1916. It's the drop of the knife in his life. And it's the touch of history that really begins to bring the opposites together, because that's where the imperial vision comes together with the Irish vision, and as those opposites touch, they touch in violence, and you have the whole myth of the martyrdom and the execution of the 15 by firing squad. So he's drawn back to Ireland. He marries, he returns to Ireland, he moves into his medieval tower in Gort, and in the Irish Revolution and Civil War sees a cosmic age come to its prophesied violent end. So that he himself, in a sense, is dramatizing his polarities, because he has his tower in County Galway, and he has his home in Merrion Square, a very beautiful neo-Georgian 18th century street in Dublin. So that the opposites are played out in the movement, but he's compressing them now. It's not so much London and Sligo as it's becoming Dublin and Sligo, Dublin and Galway. But in the condition of being a senator, and living through the troubles and having a bodyguard and being in Ireland in the condition of civil war, he sees this tiny little war as not just any conflict, but part of a whole dismemberment of a world system and part of a whole prophesied end to a world age. And so he writes a poem about the bird, the stair, and the nest by his window. The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening. Honeybees come build in the empty house of the stair. We are closed in, and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Somewhere a man is killed or a house burned, yet no clear fact to be discerned. Come build in the empty house of the stair. A barricade of stone or of wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, that dead young soldier in his blood. Come build in the empty house of the stair. We had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. So in the whole development of the revolution, and in the petrification of the heart, turning it to stone, and the whole shrillness by which he sees his friends, Constance Mankiewicz turning into a kind of shrill, shrieking harpy with more substance in her enmities than in her love, he sees all of Ireland creating its own nightmare, and sees in the way that Jung would describe it, when you do not see your shadow, it's because it has you in its grip. So Ireland all through the revolution said there is no evil in Ireland, evil is English. The English brought in the evil. There is no violence here whatsoever. We are only sweet peasants. We are the purest, godliest, most moral people on the face of the earth. We are chosen messianically to redeem the evil, immoral, corrupt, mercantile empire of the British. And then as soon as they come into power, then of course they create their shadow, they project it into their own history, and then Irishman kills Irishman, and Michael Collins, the architect of terror in the Troubles, is himself assassinated, but this time by the Irish. So that the whole nightmare that's still on in Ireland is very much this kind of schizoid pattern of absolutely being unable to tolerate your own negative reflection. And the more you can't, the more you create it to pursue you. Exactly in the same way in the French Revolution, that they just declared 1789 and the rights of man, and thereby created its opposite in the Reign of Terror, and finally revolution ends up in the dictatorship with Napoleon. But Yeats himself, as artist, is of course brooding over the darkness of the unconscious. He is the man who is in dialogue with self and soul and is carrying on the dialogue with his unconscious, and so he is the man who sees the shadow and tries to raise up the vision of terror into Irish consciousness, and they will have none of it. Anytime any Irish writer at all tries to raise up the Irish consciousness of their own evil, he's expelled. And so of course the whole role of the Irish writer is exile. You see this when we were talking about Synge a couple of weeks ago, how the only role that Synge in the end of Playboy as the Western World can celebrate for the artist is to wander around the landscape telling the stories of the fools that are in Mayo, but they can't live in Mayo. They have to wander elsewhere to talk about the fools of Ireland. So Joyce has to go to Trieste and escape the condition of Ireland itself. So Civil War begins to be something larger than just a petty event of a tiny, tiny kingdom. It begins to be part of a whole conflict of good and evil that is a microcosm of something that is going on within the whole world itself. Now, in Yeats's tower, there is a turning staircase that goes widening and gyring around until you come to the top. And there, as you move from earth to the top of the tower, you come to the stars. And of course, in an Irish unpolluted landscape, the stars hang down onto the top of the tower. So in turning and turning and turning in his own tower, he's in a sense performing the mythologies of his own imagination. And his tower becomes the vertical ascension out of history into the landscape of myth. And as a poet at the top of the tower, he is the person, in the words of Wordsworth, connects the landscape with the quiet of the sky, or with the enormity of the sky. And it becomes his process to breathe in that landscape of light and then descend the tower and embody it in words in his study. So the tower becomes his symbol, and it becomes a symbol of the turning and turning in the widening gyre of his most famous poem, in which he gives the whole image of the opposites of the gyres. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Now what the visual image of this is as the falcon moves from the falconer farther and farther in its flight, it gets to the point where it cannot hear the falconer, and it creates this widening position where it's at its maximum opposite from the point of descent. And so a historical period begins with the enunciation of a myth, and then the myth elaborates from the time of Jesus until finally it gets to its limits, and the civilization can no longer hear Christ. Christian civilization is no longer a Christian civilization. It's an industrial civilization, and reaching its limits, it's about to fall apart. Therefore, the new Annunciation is about to begin, and a whole new civilization will be created, and it becomes the time of the second coming of Christ. But of course, the first Christ came in compassion to die for the world, but the second Christ comes in fury to judge the world, and he comes in conditions of war and apocalypse, and he's not the gentle, compassionate Jesus. So the second coming is a vision of terror. It's a vision of the end of the world. What he does then, in acting out the turning and turning in his tower, is to raise history into myth, and by raising it into myth through the consciousness of art, history becomes the performance of myth. And the dialectic of the opposites are acted out within his own contradictory nature, and acted out between his own life, between sitting in the Senate in Dublin and voting on legislation for new coinage for Dublin or for Ireland, and going off to his tower and hearing in the landscape of civil war rumors of soldiers assassinated. But what he has in the vision, in the tower, is a whole entire vision of Western civilization. Now, the vision came in ways that are very familiar to all of us at Lindisfarne, what we would simply call a transmission. It came in automatic writing through his wife shortly after they were married, and yet at the same time it's very clear to see that all the bits and pieces of it are really part of Yeats's system. So some critics say, who are a little more tolerant of this kind of thing, that somehow or other the barriers between his wife's mind and his broke down, and that the auras between them really became permeable membranes, and she, acting out the role of the anima, was carrying to him part of really his own nature. Because if you look back in the early Yeats, all the way back to Rosa Alchemica, and 19th century works of Yeats, you can see the little bits and pieces of a vision developing. And if you study some of the other kind of esoteric systems, you can see that these opposite triangles are in Sufism and are part of an esoteric tradition. So it's fairly clear that Yeats was being given esoteric materials. Sometimes people get it in the kind of sleep teaching at night where they just wake up the next morning and they know more than when they went to bed, and they wonder where their consciousness went when they were asleep. Or it comes through the mediumistic qualities of the feminine principle, and in his case it came through automatic writing from his wife. But the system was basically one of opposites, where are these two triangles, where one is moving in absolute counter-rotation to the other, so that one, in the words of Heraclitus, lives the other's death and dies the other's life. And so as one gets wider, the other gets smaller. Now this is obviously going all the way back to the unity of opposites in Pythagoras. It's picked up by Heraclitus. You can see it in alchemy, because in the first stage of alchemy, which in a grand Yeatsian way is in 4 stages, when the material in the alembic is at the stage of the chaos of the prima materia in the first stage, it's in blackening, called melanosis. But in the center of that blackening, unseen by the alchemist but known by him in consciousness, it is white. So the relationship between the black and the white is precisely the relationship between these black and white triangles that Yeats describes. So there's a whole articulation of a philosophy that is really a perennial philosophy. This esoteric system wasn't created by Yeats, but it's articulated in a way by him and by his wife that's not available anywhere else. If you see some things in African mythology, you'll see triangles similar to this in the Dogon creative cosmology. Sometimes you'll pick up these triangles in other kinds of writers getting very close to it. They'll talk about the relationship of the neutrino as having negative spin, and they'll show the format for the neutrino, and it begins to look very much like these Yeatsian triangles. So the system is really archetypal, and therefore not an individual creation, and yet if you tried to conceive a vision with the rational mind, it really would stagger the imagination, and certainly Yeats did not have that kind of scientific mind, because you have to take the 4 faculties and the 28 phases of the moon and the zodiac, and then the whole other system of 4 with the creative husk and the spiritual body, and set it in counter-rotation to one another. And to picture the whole model in your mind, it would almost take a computer terminal, the kind of sketchpad thing where you rotate a model in 3D in design centers at MIT. So that it's fairly clear that what Yeats is coming out with is larger than a rational construction, and yet somehow he's in digging into his own conscious, he's gone down so deep that he's hit the subterranean stream of the underground Gnostic and Hermetic tradition, and it's coming up, but in very intensely articulated forms, so articulated that it's very different from alchemy or Rosicrucianism. Nevertheless, of course, Yeats had studied all these things. He was an initiate in the Golden Dawn, which is an esoteric lodge. He was very familiar with the work of Blake and Swedenborg, so he was no stranger to mysticism. And yet what comes out in a vision is like no other mystical system. So it's an intensely original aspect. If we now think of these opposites like matter and antimatter, or the left and right hemispheres of the brain, it's probably the case that the dialectical relationship between these 2 triangles is really expressive of the structure of consciousness. He's talking about basically 2 systems. There's the primary white gyre, which is that kind of man who seeks as his goal wisdom, and there's the dark black antithetical gyre, which is that kind of man who seeks as his goal beauty. And then he shows these in the system of rotation through the phases of the moon. And as of course we know from, say, Alexander Marshek's book on the roots of civilization, the oldest system of knowledge, going all the way back to 26,000 BC, are the phases of the moon and the notations for the phases of the moon on the bâton de commandement from the Perigordian and from the Franco-Cantabrian area of the Paleolithic. So it's really interesting that the earliest form of knowledge is the phases of the moon, and precisely what Yeats is articulating in the 20th century is the system of the phases of the moon. But even deeper than that, There probably are projections of archetypal forms at the very root formation of the structure of consciousness, the relationship between the intuitive and the ratiocinative, between the left and the right hemispheres, is two interpenetrating triangles such that in the balanced person there is a point in the middle where you achieve what he calls unity of being. And that's a particular balance that can only exist for a particular time. Now, the vision of history that he has of these triangles pulsing so that you begin with a myth and it moves through time till it reaches its maximum, and then when it's at its maximum, the new myth expands and the other one widens, dwindles down. And so he sees this like a kind of complex gyring DNA molecule as the process by which man moves through time. We begin in 4000 BC with the primary jar. Primary man is fact-oriented, materialistic, and seeks as his object knowledge, wisdom. So 4000 BC is, in conventional history, the Uruk phase and the beginning of the urban revolution. And so here is the enunciation of the primary jar. The antithetical would be the declining matriarchal civilization, so that if you go from, say, Anatolia, from, say, 6,000 to 4,000, you see the decline of matriarchy, the decline of the traditional blood civilization, everything that Erich Neumann talks about in the Origins and History of Consciousness. And then in 4000 BC, the new sunlight, the rise of rational man, the displacement of the matriarchal gods, and the rise of Enki and Enlil in Sumer. So here it just begins. And now it widens as it goes through time until you reach the point here where you have unity of being, where the declining antithetical gyre going down and the ascending primary jar are perfectly balanced, and you have unity of being, and this is always the classical moment in time for Yeats. And this is Sumer. This is the Sumer at its flourishing in 3000 BC, and his literate civilization and the clay tablets. But time does not rest. And so there is a kind of thermodynamic irreversibility of events, that all things are vanishing. And as this continues, the balance is lost, and the primary begins to widen up to its maximum and reaches its limit, where it will begin to decline. And then right at the limit, the eye in the hurricane spins out a new cosmic enunciation, a new mythology, and we have the barbarians coming in with the new antithetical, the new violence, the new destruction of civilization. In 2000 BC is the fall of Ur and the rise of the wild nomads and the moral, emotional vision, and you get Father Abraham and the collapse of Ur. The new antithetical brings in a fabulous formless darkness, the Babylonian starlight brought in, and it, as is mentioned in one of his poems, and this begins to widen up to its balance point of unity of being. And you have the classical phase in which he writes about, say, Leda and the Swan. And you have 1000 BC in the general time of the fall of Troy, and the Mycenaean, Minoan, central Mediterranean civilization. So this is a balance point, and again is another great classical era. Then the darkness keeps going until you get finally the triumph in the time of Christ, in the empire, and the darkness of passion and emotion, and the opposite is created, the incarnation of Christ and the new primary man, which will generate a civilization that will be externalizing, fact-oriented, not hierarchical, moving toward democracy, and it achieves its period balance point of unity of being in Byzantium in 1000 BC, and this is why he said, if I could choose to be alive in a particular time, I choose to be alive in Byzantium at around 1000. And so he writes a poem called Byzantium. And but there the balance is lost, and it continues to move until finally you have the primary nature that was implicit as a seed in the incarnation of the Christos into matter becoming fully visible at its vanishing, again, sunset effect, here at the end, where an intensely mechanistic, materialistic civilization of planetary industrialization triumphs, but right at the point it's triumphing, it reaches its limit, and then the shock of incarnation, the enunciation of the new antithetical, which means passion, hierarchy, violence, blood, and intense, passionate beauty, the opposite of the shopkeepers of Birmingham and Manchester and those who fumble in their greasy tills. So at 2000 AD, he talks in a vision of the limit and uses the phrase the limit. Now it's really interesting, this notion of the limit, because in Yeats it's articulated at the same time that Whitehead is giving the Lowell lectures in Harvard. He's talking about the limit. Spengler is talking about the limit. Heisenberg in an essay also says that we have reached the limit to this civilization. And of course in the bestseller, The Limits to Growth, you get the articulation of the limits to industrialization. So people as opposite as MIT computer experts and quantum mechanics physicists and philosophers and Yeats and historians or meta-historians like Spengler all see the same thing, that now there is a moment on which our civilization cannot go any further and that something else is about to begin, and it will not come from the democratic materialism, primary fact-loving. It will be more mysterious, more Aquarian, more esoteric, and all the esoteric traditions pop up right at the point that the limit is reached. Now, again, the way Yeats would express that is in the image of when Jupiter and Saturn meet, what a crop of mummy wheat. Now, mummy wheat is the seeds that were buried in the tombs of Pharaoh, and then when they're taken out and dropped into the earth, they spring alive again. So Sufism and yoga and Buddhism and Tantra and all these incredible ancient Hellenistic mystery cults left from the previous epic spring to life at the limits, and like a crop of mummy spring to new life and contain the seeds for what will become the new antithetical dispensation. Now as this reaches its limit in 2000 AD and we reach the latter days and the apocalypse, then the new civilization comes in, but it will not reach its own phase of unity of being until 3000 AD. So we are going to experience the whole continuation of the dwindling down and the whole widening of the antithetical. But for those who are sensitive to the unconscious, then everything that's implicit in this seed time is already visible. So that for most of us here at Lindisfarne, the implications of the New Age are already seen in microcosm, as long as we're not idealistic and think it's all just going to be goody, goody, good stuff, and it's not going to have its own shadow and its own terror in it. And as this expands, it will become visible to other people. So we can see the event here occurring in myth. If we have a mythopoeic consciousness, it will not become visible to other people until it's experienced as history. This is in the same way that Blake could see the Industrial Revolution, but the rest of mankind couldn't see it until 1851, but he could see it in 1790. So this is the way in which mythology and mythography becomes a way of understanding history more successfully than the experts and the historians can, because of course they have this kind of tunnel vision that only allows them to see particular artifacts in front of them. But at any rate, this is a time of terror, and it's this whole vision of terror that Yeats is seeing from the view from the tower. Now, as he articulates these opposites within himself, the way he's living in time is to move more consciously from simple romantic adolescent escape to move away and say, come away, for the world's more full of suffering than you will ever understand, to more of a confrontation with suffering, more of an engagement with one's opposite, the battle with the shadow. And as he does that, he moves from escape to Aufheben, the Hegelian sense of lifting up and negating and transcending it. So Yeats negates history with myth. He doesn't simply negate it in the full English sense of that, but history itself is negated and affirmed and transcended. So history goes into Aufheben in myth. So he acts out his myth into history, and so he negates, lifts up, and preserves, and finally transcends history. All of those are contained in the meaning of Hegel's Aufheben. Now, out of the contradictory tension between escape and action, he really achieves a new affirmative being, because in full touch with his shadow, he develops a consciousness very different from the wrap the green flag round me boys of the early revolution, or the demonic kind of killer terrorists of the Michael Collins variety from the Troubles. And in A Dialogue of Self and Soul, he writes a poem exactly about that war of opposites, and ends up with a kind of positive affirmation that is not simply negating life and saying we just simply ping and pong from one extreme to another. It's a long poem, but I think I'll read it anyway. Bear with me. A dialogue of self and soul. This is back and forth between my soul and myself. My soul. I summon to the winding ancient stair. Set all your mind upon the steep ascent, upon the broken, crumbling battlement, upon the breathless starlit air. Upon the star that marks the hidden pole, fix every wandering thought upon that quarter where all thought is done. Who can distinguish darkness from the soul? So here is the soul, the daemon, in winding up the ancient stair, moving into the starlight where eternal time is held, and to experience eternal time, you must stop the breath, and you must stop the beat of the heart, and there take in the enormity and be so swamped with the void, with the sunya, that who can distinguish darkness from the soul? So this is the whole vision of the daemon, and then the ego in historical time answers back to the daemon. Myself. The consecrated blade upon my knees is Sato's ancient blade, still as it was, still razor keen, still like a looking glass unspotted by the centuries. That flowering silk and old embroidery torn from some court lady's dress, and round the wooden scabbard bound and wound, can tattered still protect, faded adorn. He was given by, I've forgotten the Japanese man's name, a sacred sword, and he was very much caught with the talismanic quality of it, and when he was in the fury of negating the liberals' goody-goody vision of progress, he would sort of pull out the sword and say, more violence, and become totally intoxicated with the time of his senescence, which, or his old age, since he was never senescent or senile, because as he was, of course, dying, all Europe was going into World War II. So he himself was very much a person who grew up in the Pax Britannica, and thought when they were children that soldiers would just wear their uniforms for decoration and parades, and that war was over in Europe, and then experienced the enormity of the First World War, then the Irish Revolution, and then the Irish Civil War, and now was seeing all of Europe going into the enormity of the planetary conflict of World War II. My soul. Why should the imagination of a man long past his prime remember things that are emblematical of love and war? Think of ancestral night that can, if but imagination, scorn the earth and intellect its wandering to this and that and the other thing, deliver from the crime of death and birth. Myself. Monteshigi, third of his family, fashioned it 500 years ago. About it lie flowers from I know not what embroidery, hearts purple, and all these I set for emblems of the day against the tower, emblematical of the night, and claim as by a soldier's right a charter to commit the crime once more. My soul. Such fullness in that quarter overflows and falls into the basin of the mind, that man is stricken deaf and dumb and blind, for intellect no longer knows, is from the ought or knower from the known, that is to say, ascends to heaven. Only the dead can be forgiven, but when I think of that, my tongue's a stone. So all of this, of course, think upon that quarter overflows, is the quarter of the phase of the moon, and all of this is sort of technical language for explaining which particular phase of the moon Yeats is at, and what happens to the soul when it's in an incarnation at either the 17th phase, or the first quadrant, or the second quadrant, or the third quadrant, or fourth. Myself. A living man is blind and drinks his drop. What matter if the ditches are impure? What matter if I live it all once more, endure that toil of growing up, the ignominy of boyhood, the distress of boyhood changing into man, the unfinished man and his pain brought face to face with his own clumsiness. The finished man among his enemies, how in the name of heaven can he escape that defiling and disfigured shape, the mirror of malicious eyes cast upon his eyes, until at last he thinks that shape must be his shape? And what's the good of an escape if honor find him in the wintry blast? I am content to live it all again and yet again, if it be life to pitch into the frog spawn of a blind man's ditch, a blind man battering blind men, or into that most fecund ditch of all, the folly that man does or must suffer if he woos a proud woman not kindred of his soul. I am content to follow to its source every event in action or in thought, measure the lot, forgive myself the lot. When such as I cast out remorse, so great a sweetness flows into the breast. We must laugh and we must sing. We are blessed by everything. Everything we look upon is blessed. So the interesting thing is it's the soul, the self, the ego, that has the last word. And it's very much the denial of the attempt to escape an absolute transcendent purity where the heart stops and one experiences cosmic time. He comes back to the burden of the body, sets the heart beating again, and with the beating of the heart knows all the beating of the opposites, thinks back of all the pain and conflict, the unrequited love of Maud Gunn, the whole aspect of the crime of death and birth and samsara. But there is the affirmation of samsara against nirvana. And it's very much a rejection of Buddhism and an affirmation of the realization of the infinite in the tiny. And so it's a rejection of transcendence, and what's the good of an escape? But of course he's talking to himself, because his whole life has been an attempt to escape from the condition of pain, and only now, at the end of an enormously full life, can he say, we are blessed by everything. At other times he would be so caught in the pain of it that he would cry out against it and try to escape. So obviously the poem is not simply one voice, it's very much the dialectic of both voices, but it's very interesting how he chooses to give the ego the last word and achieves that kind of mysticism of the ordinary, which in the aphorisms of Nagarjuna in Madhyamika Buddhism comes out to be the affirmation of opposites, that nirvana is samsara and samsara is nirvana, and you reach the point when the whole attempt to sit cross-legged and meditate yourself into nirvana becomes the adolescent attempt to escape the fury and mire of human veins. Now, in terms of his life, he sits as a senator in the East in Dublin to build a nation-state at a time when nation-states are becoming ridiculous. And while in the West, in his tower in Galway, he works out the prophetic code for the collapse of a whole era. And so in the same time that he's in time, he can see the enormity and yet not become confused with the archetypal. Now, in Jungian psychology, one of the things that happens to religious people, especially religiously possessed people, is that their egos are blown away and they inflate and they identify with the archetypal level and they say, I am the Satguru, I am the Messiah, I am the savior of the age, I am the avatar. And they just become all stretched out of shape with this kind of cosmic narcissism. Whereas the artist, who has such a healthy ego, can take up the burden of time and is so rooted to the ordinary that he does not inflate, because in some sense the body and time and history are carrying him and weighing him down, so that he can in a sense affirm and not lose a sense of himself and not get caught in the archetypal level of consciousness that the prophet does. You sense when you're dealing with someone, say like the mother in Oroville, that when she's talking about reversing the cells of her body and not dying and waiting for her lover Aurobindo to return to her, she is so identified with the cosmic mythology of the race that she has lost touch with time and her historical moment and her ego and this body, and is so in the other that she's no longer in her body, and of course has lost touch with her own death. Now, in Castaneda's sense, of course, you would not do this. You would keep death at your shoulder, and you would maintain the familiarity with death, and therefore develop the liberation in exactly the opposite way. The artist doesn't seem to fall into that category mistake, to use a philosophical term. The artist, whether it's the Stockhausen or the Yeats, seems to be in a position that because he has to take matter and history and the brute facts of life and raise them into significant form, he can never really lose touch with that form, because the ego then becomes not just simply the burden of his affliction, as it would be in absolutely pure Buddhist terms, but it becomes the weight and substance of his art. And so the opposites have to be balanced. And so for Yeats, the affirmation is the artist, it's the person in history, it's the affirmation of time at the same time that he knows all times are vanishing. Maybe that's a good way to show in another poem how Yeats celebrates, in a sense, the fact that all things are vanishing and only at their sunset do they achieve their full beauty, and that in the thermodynamic irreversibility of events, one has to come to terms with dissolution if one is to understand the fullness of form. In pity for man's darkening thought, he walked that room and issued thence in Galilean turbulence. The Babylonian starlight brought the fabulous formless darkness in. Odor of blood when Christ was slain made all Platonic tolerance vain, and vain all Doric discipline. And here is his whole philosophy of time. Everything that man esteems endures a moment or a day. Love's pleasure drives his love away. The painter's brush consumes his dreams. The herald's cry, the soldier's tread, exhaust his glory and his might. Whatever flames upon the night, man's own resinous heart has fed. So the affirmation begins to be a sense that the artist accepts the condition that he's not a mystic. Now, this is easier for Yeats to do in old age, but all during his life he was fighting with A.E. A.E., George William Russell, was the true mystic. He was the man identified with the archetypal level. He was the man who could see the elementals and the devas on the ancient hills of Ireland. He was the real mystic. Yeats is not a mystic. Yeats is intuitive. He's in the 17th phase of the moon. He's the daemonic man. He's in touch with his daemon, but he is not the world-denying mystic and not the moralist that A.E. is. And all the time of his life, he's very much feeling guilt and wondering whether or not he should really go all the way and rather than being a mystical artist, be a real mystic. And so there's a very contradictory ambivalence going on in Yeats. But again, he spins on the gyre and turns around in the spiral and raises that very conflict itself up into art and writes a poem about the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. And if it take the latter, must refuse a heavenly mansion raging in the dark. When all that toil's finished, what's the news? In luck or out, the toil has left its mark. After the day's vanity, the night's remorse. I'm reciting it from memory, so there are probably a few words there that are not as they are in the text. Now, in considering the whole vision from the tower, you have to remember that Yeats saw all of this before World War II, atom bombs, LSD, pollution, genetic engineering, Apollo 12, brain control. He really knew nothing of the Maya calendar, of the Book of the Hopi, and all the prophecies agree, even the pop mysticism of 2001. Somehow they all converge that on the year 2000, or in the Maya calendar 2011, a whole world cycle comes to an end. Or in the words of Yeats, now his wars on God begin, at stroke of midnight God shall win.